Hello, I'm Wendy Edelberg, Director of the Hamilton Project. We are very pleased to have you here for our event, Rethinking Workforce Development, Policies to Protect Workers and Families. You'd think I would have memorized that title. This is the first in a series of events that we will have over the course of the spring, ambitiously trying to rethink and reimagine the social insurance system. Of course, it's not a new thing to be thinking about how to improve the social insurance system. And in fact, all of the people participating in today's event have been thinking about just that issue for a very long time. But the events over the last year with the COVID-19 recession have made it that much more urgent that we've seen the issues with our current social insurance system, and we can see better ways forward. And so this event begins that series. We're very excited about it. We will start with a fireside chat between Jason Furman and Penny Pritzker. Penny Pritzker is founder and chairman of PSP Partners, and she was U.S. Secretary of Commerce under President Obama. Jason Furman is a professor of practice of economic policy at Harvard, and he was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama. And we're very thrilled to hear their discussion. After them, we will have a short presentation by the Hamilton Project's very own policy director, Kristen Broady, who will describe how automation is expected to continue to remake the labor market over the next decades. And then finally, we will have a roundtable discussion among a bunch of excellent experts, and we're very excited to hear their views. And we will also discuss the policy proposal that we've released today by Harry Holzer of rethinking the workforce development system. Let me just give you a few housekeeping details. We will be live tweeting at Hamilton Proj using the hashtag workforcedev. If you have any questions, we will be monitoring Twitter. And we will also be monitoring our email. You can email us at info@hamiltonproject.org. And with that, I'm very, very happy to turn things over to Jason and Penny.
Well, Penny, it's great to be sitting right next to a fireside chatting with you in this very intimate setting here on Zoom. We are right now about 12 million jobs short of the trend that we were on prior to the pandemic. Those are 12 million people without jobs. They had perfectly adequate skills to be in jobs before. They didn't lose their jobs because of lack of training or lack of skills. They lost their jobs because of a pandemic and a recession it caused. I think we both agree that the most important thing to get them back into their jobs also isn't training. It's vaccines to control the pandemic. It's ensuring there's sufficient demand so that as things reopen, people go back to their jobs. But as we build back better, I think we also do want to be thinking about training. So I guess, Penny, my first question I wanted to ask you is now the right time to even be talking about training? People get so upset when they hear the word skills gap. Do we need to wait till things get better? Or should we actually be, should the president be focused on this right now?
Well, Jason, first of all, it's great to see you. And it's a real pleasure to be here for the Hamilton Project. Absolutely now is the time to focus on this issue because, before the pandemic, we had too many Americans that were struggling with disruption. And the pandemic has only accelerated employers' move towards displacing workers with technology and automation. In fact, 43% of businesses now anticipate reducing their workforce due to technology. And so I think that if you take the twin impact of the pandemic, which you talked about, as well as automation in particular, it's really having a serious impact, particularly on our most vulnerable workers. Black and brown workers have borne the brunt of the impact so far. We have huge unemployment among young Black men, 25.5%, and young brown women, 19.7%. So there is a long-term challenge that we have to face. And you've heard me talk about this for over a decade. This is an area of passion and I think the pandemic has only forced adoption of technology quicker. And so we've got to, as a government, devote more resources, more of our GDP to making sure that our workers are prepared for the environment, the work environment of today and of the future. And it's only going to become more so a challenge. We spend 0.1% of GDP in our country, the lowest, I think lower than only 2 other OECD countries. Mexico and Chile spend less, and less than half of what we spent 30 years ago on workforce training. And I know that we very much value higher education in this country. We spend about $75 billion a year, but only $18 billion a year on making sure that our workers have the training that they need. It doesn't make sense. As Richard Haas, our mutual friend at the Council on Foreign Relations, has said, it used to be when you and I were going to school, you could fill up your gas tank with your intellectual gas tank with education at the beginning of your career, and then basically run your career on that one tank of gas. That is not possible anymore. You've got to continue to acquire additional skills, particularly in this very dynamic era. And the administration understands that. The rescue bill, the American Rescue Plan is really, really essential to get the economy going again. And to get us, as you said, most important that we get everyone vaccinated and we get over this hump and we help people who are struggling. But we can't just help them short term. We have to help them long term be on a path to be able to continually be employed. And so I very much predict there'll be a second bill that'll have much more focus on robust, longer-term economic growth, and training needs to be a part of that. We have to invest in our people.
And Penny, what would be your priorities for that? And are there things that you've done and seen sort of on the ground personally in Chicago and the like that you think are sort of ready for prime time, ready for scaling? They just need some federal money to really get them going.
Well, the first thing, Jason, that I know from my own experience is that training needs to be demand driven. And what do we mean by demand driven? Demand driven means that you've got the employers locally need to say, here's the skill sets that we're missing. And the community colleges and the university need to train towards those jobs. And so that the skilling is what I call employability skilling, not reskilling or upskilling, but it's towards good jobs. And so that's the first thing that I know. And one of the biggest challenges, for example, we face in Chicago around that is the fact that as we say in government, what's the mechanism for a community college or university to understand? What's the infrastructure to understand what is the demand? We've had to create that in Chicago. We created an organization called P33, and it actually brings employers together, the chief human resources officers together, and says, here are our major gaps. Here's what we need. And then they're working with the community colleges and the universities to provide employees that have the appropriate training at scale. And at scale is a big challenge. So we're working, on, and to get to scale means you also need the support of governors and mayors. It's hard for any one university or one employer to do this. You've got to bring folks together. What I've seen is that you need, in Chicago, our experience is, we've set up the first of its kind, what we call Tech Talent Lab. At a subsidiary of the University of Illinois called Discovery Partners Institute, where they're fundamentally bringing the engineering training of the University of Illinois Engineering School, which sits in Champaign. We're bringing particularly needed courses into Chicago. And our goal is to train, we're working towards being able, with the high schools and the community colleges, to train 7,000 people a year annually towards jobs that actually exist. And our goal is to have half of those people, over 3,000, be women, Blacks, and Hispanics. And so building a system at scale is really hard. And I don't know that it's been done, but that's the aspiration that needs to happen locally, because the solutions are place-based. They need to happen locally. But we need national support for this as well. There are two major efforts that we've seen that are anchoring this tech talent lab at the Discovery Partners Institute. One is a high school to career pathway program, which includes not only instruction for high demand jobs, but it also includes coding and internships and mentorships and additional guidance counseling and sort of last mile financial aid. So you can imagine that's a lot to bring together. The second is to do upskilling of existing employees. So to work with the employers to say, okay, how do we give your employees training? How can we partner with you to make sure that your employees are getting the training that they need? It's hugely complicated. It requires a lot of coordination, but without a targeted effort locally, it won't happen. It doesn't just come together. And so those are some of the lessons that I've learned. And the thing I know, Jason, is business is essential to this. You've got to understand from businesses what are their demands. But I'd love to know from you, you research this area, what do you see as the most effective workforce solutions?
Right. Well, we have a lot of the best researchers coming up after this, whose views are the ones I always listen to. But Penny, I agree with you that, I worry there's going to be a lot of reallocation coming out of COVID, that, some jobs will disappear, other opportunities will open up. In the last recession, some people use skills gap as an excuse to not do enough to support jobs and aggregate demand. I think that's really unfortunate, but I don't think that's what we're talking about here. The American Rescue Plan is already $1.9 trillion to support demand. We're talking about, as you said, a longer term building back better. So I think, this is sort of a both and, not an either or. In terms of specifics, I think the challenge one has to navigate is there's different types of populations one cares about. You've emphasized, I think, a lot disadvantaged workers in your comments, Black, Hispanic, and the like. I think that's a really important area. I think, by the way, community college, I don't know if you count that as training or count that as higher education when you're talking, but that's an area that we did some small investments in the Obama administration. I think the evidence is very, very strong. There's the dislocated workers, which in some ways is a harder population to reach, especially at older ages. My reading of the literature is that programs there have a mixed track record, which is to say some of them have ended up working, some of them haven't. I'm not positive if we know enough yet to know quite which ones are which. So I do think that including a strong evaluation component in whatever we do continues to be especially important in this area. If you want to give people a check, that's worth evaluating. Larry Katz has evaluated that in New York. But, in some sense, if you give someone a check, they're going to get money. These programs only work to the extent people get jobs and get jobs at higher wages. The last thing I would say is, I think in addition to money, there is a regulatory part to all of this. Things like the for-profit educational sector. There's a lot of really problematic programs there, a lot of things taking advantage of people. That was something in the Obama administration. We brought more regulations in. They got rid of those in the Trump administration. I hope some of those come back so that you're sort of targeting the bad apple side. But what, if you were advising, and you probably are advising on Build Back Better, what would be like specifically that you would recommend that President Biden, prioritize in that? I think he'll hopefully have a lot of room to do a lot of things, but he will need to prioritize and know what to do.
So Jason, let me get to your question in 1 second. On the dislocated worker, I started with a woman named Marie Lynch, a program called Skills for Chicagoland's Future that actually Gina Raimondo as governor in Rhode Island adopted, and she'll be our next Commerce Secretary, assuming all goes well. And they match current and unmet hiring needs with qualified, particularly long-term unemployed. So the dislocated worker, if you will. And this program has placed over 6,500 job seekers in working with 100 employers. Now, again, the challenge here is you really have to connect the dots between employers and what they need. And then you have to work with the social service organizations to understand where those folks are. That's a kind of infrastructure or mechanism, whatever word you want to use, we don't have enough of in our country, I think. In terms of specific recommendations to the Biden administration, I would say the following. First of all, the administration has not laid out specific plans at this point, except to throw out a number of about $50 billion to spend on worker training. And I would say this is a unique moment and I would go bigger. And you know me, Jason, I'm not one for always going bigger. You and I have had those debates at times, but this is a moment I would go bigger and have more inclusive skilling. And I would make it such a priority. I would put the vice president in charge of this and have the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Labor support that effort. I think some of the other things to do are, as we talked about, demand-driven programs, engaged with both our community colleges. And I think the community colleges are a huge source of training and, parts of higher education, if you will. They play an incredible role. And the governors have a role to play in terms of working with employers throughout their states and mayors within the major cities to say, with the workers, what do you need? I can help organize that with the community colleges. I do think we should establish worker training tax credits. And I think, look, we have an R&D tax credit. Why shouldn't I get a tax credit for investing in our people? More and more, the modality for getting things done is through people, not necessarily just through capital expenditures. And so I think we should make that a priority. I would create lifelong learning accounts of some sort, make Pell Grants more flexible, and really develop a program for displaced workers. The TAA program, as you and I have talked about over the years, is just absolutely insufficient. And then I think a couple other things I would do. I would make sure that data collection is part of the initiative. We need to understand more about training and the impact on wages and employment and get more information so that you and your colleagues and the folks on this panel can analyze and tell us what's working and what's not working. And then, I think that, again, I'll just keep emphasizing the private sector needs to be a partner in this effort, because ultimately, most of the employment is through the private sector. And I think there is a political challenge I do want to talk about, which is we've somehow made it easy to understand that we need to invest in infrastructure. And there seems to be bipartisan support for investing in roads and bridges and in the digital backbone and broadband and things like that. But I don't think we've really done a good job of explaining the benefit of investing in our workforce. And I think that to build up the kind of bipartisan support that exists, I think, for let's call it infrastructure spending. And so I think there is work to be done by the administration and others, such as yourself, and this effort to really talk about what is the benefit to our society? How will we remain competitive? Why is competitiveness about our people, not just about our companies? How does the benefit inure to the individual, not just the corporation? And so I think there's work to be done in terms of laying that out in a way where people, both in Congress, but the general population understands the importance of that.
Yeah. And one thing just to underscore that I think might have been implicit in what you said about TAA, which is that, and I think there's a unanimity among policy people on this, it just doesn't make any sense that the training program you get is based on the reason you lost your job. If you lost your job, you don't care whether it's because of trade, technology, the incompetence of your boss, or something else. And so having some type of greater universality of programs that, you know, doesn't ask why you lost it, that does last for a lifetime.
You know, and you're exactly right, Jason, that why you lost your job is sort of semi-irrelevant, and it should be about what jobs are open.
Yeah. So we're getting one question from the audience about apprenticeships and the opportunity for scaling those. So curious what your own experience and observation in that is, and again, what the role of the federal government.
Well, look, scaling is I think the big challenge. I think there's been a lot of experimentation that's gone on, and what we've shown is apprenticeships work. And so my own experience in Chicago is we helped stand up with Aon and Accenture something called Apprenticeship 2020. And it's really an effort that brings companies together to collaborate with the community college system. So to take young people out of our community college system and put them into apprenticeships. And per year right now, we've got about 45 companies, and we're doing just short of 400 apprenticeships a year. The goal is to get to the thousands. And what's really important to get that done is not just the cooperation of the community colleges in terms of the kind of training that and education that's being provided, but most important is the recognition by the corporations that this is absolutely a new opportunity for recruiting. And what's, you know, if you want to get somebody, here's someone, a CEO who's so enthusiastic about this, talk to Greg Case from Aon or talk to Julie Sweet from Accenture. They get that this is working for them as employers as a new source of great talent and often diverse talent as well. And so this is a program where employers have come together, and it really, really works.
Great. And mentioning those employers, by the way, getting back to the bipartisan consensus, making this, you know, like infrastructure, you know, how much is the business community pushing this, first of all? And second of all, when they push good things, I'm happy. But should we be nervous that any aspect of this is trying to get the government to pay for something that they themselves should do? And, you know, demand side training says tailor it more for the local business. You know, why isn't the local business doing that? How do you answer those types of questions? You know,
my experience of this is often there's a partnership, and that the corporation is putting up a certain amount of the money. I think it's less about money and more about collaboration and getting that kind of cooperation going. I haven't found it to be, this is a way that I'm not going to invest in people as much. I appreciate the skepticism or concern about trying to lay off costs, but my experience has been actually, frankly, Jason, that corporations are struggling to find the talent they need. And they're desperate for new sources and opportunities. Now, on the other, you know, on the flip side, I have seen, in fact, I was talking to a governor this week about recruiting a electric vehicle company And they were talking about, look, one of the things I could do is to really, force greater cooperation in terms of training that goes on as an incentive. So, sometimes these incentives are the governors and mayors are excited to do them because it's a way to recruit a corporation, a new business or a new sector to their local economy. So it's often a mix.
Great. And we only have a little bit more time, but there was one more, question we got just related to sort of roadblocks that people face. What do you think gets in the way right now? Is it, money, that people don't have the opportunity? Do they not know what's out there? What type of barriers are there for people, and how can, and I think you've covered a lot of it already, but how can we, open some of those roadblocks or take down?
I think first is one is information, making sure that the information in terms of these opportunities is made available. Broadband access is a huge issue. And I see it in Chicago and see it in the communities that I work in, where there's just unequal broadband access. And I would say shame on us. We spent a lot of time focused on rural broadband. What's come to light is, in addition to rural broadband challenges, we have broadband challenges in our inner cities, because what we counted before as broadband access was you could go to a library, you could go to a hotspot, you could go to a school. That's, as we all know, when we're doing everything from home, if you will, and probably more and more will occur from home as we go forward, even post-vaccine, there will still be significant important. Getting equal broadband access, I think, is a significant part of addressing this challenge as well. And the other is, there's a role for the federal and local governments to play in terms of their own skills openings. As I understand, the federal government today has 200,000 open cybersecurity jobs. That's crazy, right? At a time when we have high unemployment, we ought to be training folks into those jobs. So there's a role for all of us to play around information exchange, broadband access, and a real understanding of making available to everyone an understanding of where are those opportunities and what is the training I need to be able to take that job.
Great. Well, this has been a great discussion. I think a lot of what's come through here is some clear messages. One, we know that we can spend and invest a whole lot more in this area. Two, the demand-driven theme. Three, the universality, regardless of what your source of job loss. Four, the real critical importance of this for disadvantaged workers. And then perhaps, most importantly, I think this is an area, my own impression, that we know enough to know we need to do more. We know enough to know some of those things, but it is an area where we do need to continue doing research, doing learning, putting new ideas. It's not 100% solved, just go and implement it. But nor do we want to wait for the research paper to come back. So we want something iterative where we're continuing to debate and discuss the ideas, which we're about to continue with in this session, while also, making the investments to build up and scale all of that. So Penny, you did amazing work on this in the government. You've been doing amazing work on this in Chicago. And I hope you're listened to in the next phase of the plan here.
Well, Jason, as always, it's great to partner with you. And I look forward to further discussion and debate on so many subjects. And thanks for all the great work you do.
Okay. And next we have Kristen Broady, who's the research director of the Hamilton Project, who's going to share some of the research in this area with all of us.
Thank you so much, Jason. So my presentation is entitled Race and Jobs at High Risk of Being Automated in the Age of COVID. The paper is co-authored with Darlene Booth Bell, and Jason Coupe. So let's start with, what is automation? Automation is robotics. It's 3D printing, machine learning, I'm being told to turn on my video, so let's see if I can do that. I don't think so. One moment. Okay. Smart systems, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence. It's the use of largely automatic equipment in a system of manufacturing or other production process. So let's talk about how COVID-19 is accelerating automation, because it's happening for a couple of different reasons. First, recessionary periods often accelerate efficiency-enhancing changes in the economy, both as individual firms aim to reduce costs while retaining their productive capacity, and resources are reallocated towards the most productive companies and industries. With decreased revenues due to the pandemic and associated economic shutdown, many companies seeking to cut costs will transition from human workers to machines for automatable tasks. Second, though the Trump administration seized on the confluence of the United States-China trade war and stalled international travel to make the case to manufacturers to bring their business back to the United States to increase American jobs, a wave of factory jobs returning to the US has yet to occur. Furthermore, manufacturing no longer determines the conditions of the US workforce, as fewer than 1 in 10 Americans works in manufacturing, compared to 1 in 4 in 1970. Companies that are choosing to expand US manufacturing operations have factories that are heavily automated. Finally, reshoring would increase labor demand and labor costs nationwide. Managers facing higher labor costs could be encouraged to increase automation rather than hire more American workers with higher labor costs. Both advances in automation and the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic disproportionately affect Black and Latino workers. So let's talk about jobs that are at high risk of automation. This slide looks at the jobs that employ the most Americans at high risk of being automated. So I have 30 jobs. This first slide lists the first 15 of them. I won't read them all to you, but I'll start with the first one. There are 3.16 million cashiers. That particular job has an automation risk score of 97%, meaning that 97% of the tasks in that 8-hour-a-day job could be done by a computer or other sort of machine. And so when we look at how this is broken down by race, that job entails 2.92% of the Black workforce, compared to 1.79% of the white workforce and 2.75% of the Hispanic workforce. Coming to the end, when we look at all 30 of these jobs, we see that 36,271,000 people are employed in jobs that are high risk of being automated in the next 10 to 20 years. The average automation risk score for these jobs is 92%. And we see that Black and Hispanic workers are more represented in these jobs than white workers. So we're comparing 23.91% of the Black workforce, 30.5% of the Hispanic workforce, to 23.03% of the white workforce. So Black people are overrepresented in these jobs that are at high risk of being automated. Black people account for 13% of the US labor force, but Black workers are overrepresented in 11 of the 30 jobs that employ the most Americans and are at high risk of being automated. So taxi drivers and chauffeurs, 29.5% compared to 13% in the labor force. Industrial truck and tractor operators, 25.8%. And you can see the rest. Black people are over 1.5 times more likely to be cashiers, cooks, food preparation and serving workers, including fast food, production workers, and laborers in freight, stock, and material moving. They're over 3 times more likely to be security guards, bus drivers, and taxi drivers and chauffeurs. Let's look at the overrepresentation of Hispanic workers. Hispanic people account for 18% of the US labor force. Hispanic workers are overrepresented in 2 additional occupations: food preparation occupations at 28.1%, and dining room and cafeteria attendants and bartenders at 34.2%. These 13 positions employed 6.4 million Black and Hispanic workers in 2019. Now let's look at jobs that are at low risk of being automated. The picture will look a little bit different. So we start with elementary and middle school teachers with 3.6 million. And we see that that job has an automation risk score of 0.4%, which is very low, which suggests that we're going to have people serving in those positions long into the future. But we see that Black and Hispanic workers have a lower representation in these positions, 1.9% and 1.33% compared to 2.49% for white workers. Coming to the end, when we look at the summary, we see that there are only 22 million people in these jobs compared to 36 for the jobs at high risk of being automated. We see that they account for 14.51% of the white workforce, compared to only 11.65 and only 7.79 for the Hispanic workforce. Black people, again, account for 13% of the US labor force. But Black workers are overrepresented in only 5 of the 30 jobs that employ the most Americans and are at low risk of being automated: preschool and kindergarten teachers, logisticians, training and development specialists, education administrators, dietitians, and nutritionists. And we see that these positions only employ 311 million Black workers. Unfortunately, Hispanic workers are not overrepresented in any of the 30 jobs that employ the most Americans and are at low risk of being automated. So how do we get from high risk to low risk occupations? There are several strategic interventions that I'm going to talk about. So 2 of them are workforce training and higher education, speaking broadly. So when we look at the number of Black and Hispanic workers that are employed in these jobs, one of the things that we need to do is to invest more money in HBCUs and MSIs. Those are historically Black colleges and universities and minority serving institutions, so that pipelines can be created from school to jobs that will exist in the future with automation. In addition, we need to also focus on workforce training. Of course, there is a debate about the skills gap, and I'm not going to get into that. But what I will say is that if employers partner with schools to let them know what jobs will exist and what skills people need to have in order to do those jobs, then schools can prepare them to do so. So let's look at some specific examples. Dillard University has a center that prepares students for the future of work with automation. And I know because it's from a grant that I wrote that was funded by the UNCF. And so basically what Dillard is doing is partnering with organizations to learn what students need to know and be able to do in order to go into jobs that are going to exist. Alabama A&M has an experiential learning program where students take an internship course and a managerial communications course that prepares them for jobs. Kentucky State University has a partnership with Toyota, where students complete part of their degree at Kentucky State University, which is an undergrad institution, and part of it at the University of Kentucky, while they complete an internship with Toyota, leading to jobs that will exist. Atlanta Metropolitan State College has a partnership with Europe, where students complete a 21-hour certificate program, and then they go on to an internship and a job ultimately with one of Europe's partners. All of these are examples of programs that prepare students for jobs that will exist in the future. And so that is my presentation. I am now going to turn it over to our director, Dr. Wendy Edelberg. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. And first, I also want to offer my thanks to Jason Furman and Penny Pritzker for an excellent conversation that I think provided a super framing for the conversation that we're about to have. In particular, I think Penny made a really good point that we think it's perfectly normal to encourage firms to invest in R&D. And we should be having similar conversations about encouraging firms to invest in their workers, just as important, perhaps even more important. And she also talked about the critical role of the demand side aspect to this, making sure that the training that we're doing is done in service of jobs, of preparing workers for jobs that firms indeed have available. So I just want to thank them for that. And then, of course, we just heard from Kristen Broady telling us which demographic groups and which jobs are at greatest risk of either disappearing or changing dramatically as a result of automation, so that we know where the needs will be from the worker side. And so with that, let's turn it over to our expert panel. Let me introduce them very quickly. We have Harry Holzer, who is a professor at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy and a non-resident senior fellow in economic studies at Brookings, and also the author of the proposal that the Hamilton Project published today, ambitiously rethinking the workforce training system and giving really concrete suggestions to policymakers. We have Larry Katz, professor of economics at Harvard. And we have Madhuri Kommareddi, Director of Workforce Development in the state of New York. And finally, Marc Morial, the President and CEO of the National Urban League. And I'm just thrilled to have all four of them with us. So first, let's start with you, Harry. It would be great if you could take a few minutes and give us some highlights from the proposal that we published today.
Well, thank you, Wendy. Thanks to Wendy and Kristen and the entire Hamilton team for inviting me to write this proposal and for helping me a lot along the way and for sponsoring this event today. I really appreciate it. Well, before I get into my proposal, I want to start with what's the problem that we want to resolve. And I think a major problem in US labor markets today is that too few Americans, too few young people or adults have the skills or the credentials that employers seek and that employers reward in the labor market. In fact, only about half of all Americans have any kind of a post-secondary credential, whether you're talking about BA or higher, or associate degree or certificate. And even some of the ones they have don't have great labor market value. So to me, that's the primary challenge that we want to think about when we talk about improving workforce policy. When we talk about workforce policy, I do want to keep our focus on two primary groups, disadvantaged workers, low income, people of color, and the workers who will be dislocated by COVID, by automation. And of course, as Kristen has just told us, those are often the same groups, both coming out of COVID and automation. So we want to keep our eye on those populations. And when I look at the workforce system, if you want to call it a system, and I'm going to focus on the sub-BA level, there's sort of three groups that I think of that comprise, separate from government, that comprise that workforce system. There's the students or workers who want to get training. There are the institutions that provide the training, community colleges, some of the for-profit schools, also some of the workforce agencies like the American Job Centers. And then there's the employers who create that demand and need those skills. And even though each of them right now is an active player in the workforce system, there are major limitations for each of those three. First of all, the students and the workers, if they want to get workforce as opposed to more academic education, they get much too little funding to support that effort. And they also get too few support services, guidance, career counseling to help them make good choices. The institutions, especially the community colleges, are also very strapped for funding. Per full-time equivalent, they get much, much less than the four-year schools, and they're often torn between their academic side, their workforce side, providing the services students need, et cetera. But I also think they face too few incentives to really spend their money on workforce and to spend it well. And then the employers in general, I think, are too disconnected from these other systems. On their own, they find it difficult to set up training programs like apprenticeships. They have too little know-how, maybe don't have the resources. And also, some economists have pointed out recently that many employers face strong incentives to automate and to replace their workers, and too little incentive in the tax system to try to retrain those workers when they're bringing the new automation in. So I think those are all things we need to address. And one other problem is this whole system is very fragmented, whether you even want to call it a system. We have the higher ed side, and we have the labor force side. We have these players who are often disconnected from each other. We have the high schools not in good alignment with the community colleges. The community colleges not in good alignment with the four-year schools. So I'd like more coherence in that whole system. And one more thing I'll say, there's been a lot of research and evaluation on what works in this area, and we have identified what we call these sector-based training programs, where the institutions work closely with employers to create the skills they need. And Larry Katz has just written an important paper on this. I'm sure he'll talk about it, but they're really small. I call them the little gems. They're too small to make a big difference. We talk a lot about replicating and scaling. Replicating and scaling are somewhat different things. And we have these efforts now to replicate these small programs, but the way we're replicating them, they're not going to get the scale we need. So if you're looking for scale, as was mentioned in the earlier panel, it's really got to be the community colleges that step forward, some of the for-profit schools as well. And that's why I focus more on the higher ed side rather than the Workforce Innovation Act and things like that. So having said all of that, let me now lay out my proposal. It has three primary strands. The first is increasing funding, but also some reforms in the Higher Education Act from the federal government that would target mostly disadvantaged workers. The second prong would be trying to impose some higher tax rates, modestly higher tax rates on employers when they displace workers, but then spending that money on the kind of tax credits or subsidies for worker retraining, on the job training. And the third prong is taking a program from the Obama years called the TACT grants, TAA, Community College Career Training Programs. That was a one-time effort in the Obama years, but the evaluation evidence is positive, creating a permanent TACT program, part formula, part competitive, to try to deal with that fragmentation, to try to integrate all those pieces, build the partnerships that we need between all these groups. The primary part of my Higher Ed Act proposal would be to inject a good-sized chunk of money into the community colleges to expand the training in the high demand fields, programs that use some of these sector-based principles, plus the support services those workers need. The tax I'm viewing, and there would be other pieces in that proposal, some money to states to expand work-based learning, trying to expand Pell Grants to cover short-term trainees, improving some of the incentives for these institutions to do good workforce policy. The tax I'm talking about would actually not be a new tax on employers when they displace. It would be cutting back a little bit of the depreciation bonuses that they get that subsidize their automation so heavily. And again, taking that money, spending it on training. I would also put some money into lifelong learning accounts. I would strengthen the warn system, the early warning system. And then, like I said, the TAC grants, a mix of formula and competitive grants. The partnerships would be community colleges, workforce systems, employer groups, and the states. And again, the goal there would be to end that fragmentation and create a much more coherent, effective system. I think if we did all these things, plus ongoing evaluation to make sure these things are working, and we scale it up gradually, I think we could make a difference and strengthen the country's workforce training programs and get more workers those skills and credentials by which they would do much better in the labor market.
Thanks, Harry. That ongoing evaluation, I mean, just as Penny and Jason were talking about, that we need to make sure that we're collecting data all the way along. So, Larry, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about partnerships in particular. So partnerships between employers and education providers, and how do we make sure that those partnerships create better pathways for people to be trained for jobs that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Wendy. And I think what we've been learning, and as Harry said, not hugely at scale, is that there are some gems out there in which intermediaries, often community-based organizations, combine with community colleges and groups of employers to basically create training and wraparound service programs for high-wage occupations and sectors that aren't the sort of jobs that you normally get through sort of WIOA training programs. And the key is having two aspects, which has a lot of information and being a sort of nimble, player in understanding what's going on in the sector. Things where employers are looking to hire now, they're having a tough time finding people, and where the sort of skills and training and connections you get have some pathway to higher wage jobs. And what we found, starting with such programs called sectoral employment training programs and evaluations over the last decade, is in 8 of 9 random assignment evaluations of programs such as Perskolas in the Bronx for IT training, Year Up, which does youth internships in a wide range of finance, business, and IT, programs like Jewish Vocational Services in Boston, which does healthcare, is we're finding in these programs basically 20 to 40 to 50% earnings increases. Now, Project Quest in San Antonio persisting 6 to 9 years out. And almost always when you're targeting higher wage sectors where you're sort of converging to the higher wage jobs, and look very different than traditional programs where you have short run move into jobs you would have gotten anyways through the WIOA training system. And the key is building up information, talking to employers, but employers are often hesitant to hire people with non-traditional backgrounds. So it's not just the screening, it's actually developing a curriculum for certifiable skills that are used broader than one single employer. And I think there are a lot of lessons there for community colleges potentially to scale them. And we're seeing similar types of things in high wage, where community college programs are rationed, say in nursing sort of professional stuff, similar 40, 50% persistent rates of return for 6 month, 1 year, 2 year sort of programs. And so I think the key is the combination of good information,
Oh, I'm worried we're losing you, Larry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. So I think it's this combination and the types of grants that Harry was talking about to community colleges to develop this sort of infrastructure is the possibility of bringing this to scale. Thanks.
Yeah, with those rates of return, yeah, it's all about scale. It's all about scale. So maybe, Madhuri, that's something that you can talk about a little bit of what can state governments do, and if state governments could solve the scaling problem, that would be super.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think a few of the things that we're interested in doing or have done in the state is one, really make our funding programs, I think, a bit more clear about what is trying to promote innovation versus what streams are trying to promote scale or replication. As Harry mentioned, those are 3 different, very different kind of sets of outcomes. But unfortunately, the way that we often craft our programs is that we have kind of one pot of money that's supposed to achieve all of those things. And it almost kind of creates an incentive for an organization, a community college, a training provider, a business, to kind of do none of those 3 things particularly well. So really kind of creating separate funding streams that really address, are you trying to innovate? Are you trying to scale? Are you trying to replicate? Because those have different parameters for success. So really being clear with the funding, what we're actually looking for. 2, another point that I think is really important that's been raised is that not every organization in the workforce development space does everything well. So community-based organizations can be particularly good at providing wraparound supports. Businesses can be particularly good at providing on-the-job training and or identifying what are those real employment pathways for jobs seekers. And then, of course, we have a number of training programs that are excellent in terms of actually training people for the skills necessary, but may not know how to do wraparound supports, may not know how to counsel an individual of how do you find a job, how do you persevere in a job when you get there. So something we're trying to also do is really think smartly about how do we create better partnership incentives so that groups don't feel like they have to do it all. So if you're a business, you don't need to do workforce supports and training and create the job pathway. You do what you do well. Similarly, community-based organizations, you don't need to do the whole kind of set of objectives to really ensure a person has a successful career pathway. So instead, how do we get organizations to partner together, bring what they do well to a training program, and not have to feel like they need to replicate everything to be successful, to either get funding or ensure a successful outcome on the back end. So I think those are two of the things that we're really trying to get focused on, is one, segregating our funding stream so that we actually have the maximum outcome for what we're looking for. And then two, trying to have organizations, again, do what they do best and not try to kind of weakly replicate other parts of the system that they're just not well suited to do.
Thanks. And so, Marc, now I'd like to turn to you. So we've talked a bunch over the past little over an hour about community colleges. They keep coming up. Do you have ideas? What do we do for students who or workers who aren't interested or able or ready to do this training through the community college system? What community-based programs can serve that population?
First of all, let me thank the Hamilton Project, and I want to thank Dr. Broady and Dr. Holzer, and each and every one of you for having me today, and thank Dr. Holzer for his continuing thoughtful contributions to this discussion. Let me begin by making just a few broad observations. In this moment in time, it is very important that any thought process about redoing the workforce system have racial intentionality in it, because the disparities in skills, in income, and in employment are so much a significant part of the problem. With the workforce that we're talking about becoming browner, more African Americans, and more Latinos, the intentionality is necessary to ensure that whatever steps we take, whatever approach we undertake, is going to be designed to close those disparities and close that gap. And so first thing we have to do is be willing to talk about it, be willing to look at the data about it, and be willing to be appropriately introspective about why what we've done over the years has moved the needle only very little when it's come to these important disparities. Number two, and these comments have been made, we don't have a coherent workforce system in the United States. It's highly fragmented. My point of view is that, to be candid, too much emphasis is placed on community colleges as the solution to the problems we discuss. Why is that the case? The graduation rates for community college at 2 years are 13%, at 3 years are 22%, at 4 years are 28%. The graduation rate for Black students at four-year colleges is 38%, and Hispanic and Latino students, 45%. Community college kids are not finishing, they're not attaining associate degrees at community colleges by and large. And so before injecting significant sums of money into that component, there needs to be an understanding of what isn't happening if the completion rates at community colleges are lower than completion rates at four-year schools. Now, I would add to that our work in this space shows us the value proposition of community-based providers, which I would admit in the vast sea are the smallest component, but the component best situated to provide not only training, but also the wraparound services that these students and these young people and these aspiring workers need. Childcare services are a considerable barrier. Transportation services are another significant barrier. Academic scheduling is a barrier we've identified, meaning the semester-based system, the time that classes take place, may not work for people who have other obligations. And we found in our work that the stickiness to a program wanes after 12 to 14 weeks. And so when we rethink the system, it's got to be tiered. There's got to be a really robust look at how community-based providers, for which there is no consistent funding stream. There's no Pell Grant, there's no taxpayer dollars. Community-based providers pretty much pursue competitive grants. There's got to be a real thought process of that as one rung on a ladder, the community colleges as another rung on the ladder, and even the four-year schools as another rung on the ladder for these particular students. We work with students, and we are young people. We're usually trying to get them into some sort of credential program. And in some instances, 10, 15% of the instances, we're onboarding them into a community college. And in maybe 5 to 8% of the cases, we're onboarding them into a four-year college experience. So while I think these observations are good, our experience at the National Urban League, providing services to about 250,000, mostly African Americans in 90 locations across the United States, has taught us some important things. So I'm a big supporter of community colleges. I'm just not for placing all eggs in that basket. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the success rates. Let's be transparent about what indeed works and find the right role for everyone. Here's the value of a community college. I was a state legislator. I represented a community college. There's a community college in every congressional district in the country. They're very powerful. They're very influential. They tell a good story. So understand my comments in the sense that I believe that this tier of community-based providers needs to be strengthened, a stream of income, a stream of revenue, a role so that the community colleges and community-based providers are not necessarily competing with each other, but they each have an important role to play. The final thing I'll say is that I'm a big believer in doing two things that we don't do in the United States anymore. From 1972 to 1999, we had a robust summer youth employment program. We put 5,000 kids to work in New Orleans in the 90s in all sorts of careers, architectural firms, and government, in the private sector, a standalone program that gave young people a career-based work experience while they were teenagers. We have to return that to the system so that kids get work experiences, career-based work experiences when they're young. That's number one. Number two, I believe very strongly in whether you call it on-the-job training, apprenticeship-based programs, any kind of program that creates a way for people to get employment and then work their way up while learning along the way. I also think it's a way to create some sustainability. So these are very important conversations. I think with the new administration, we have a chance to have it. My view on so many things now, having lived and worked in the 1990s, in the 2000s during the Obama years, is that we have to think about the here and the now. The problems are different. The poverty is different. The needs are different. The challenges are different. And we have to build, I think, a system that fits the here, the now, and the future.
So that's super. Let me ask you a follow-up question, because it's related to something that we heard from our audience, a question that was raised by one of our audience members. And it's about training being focused both on soft skills and on technical skills. And the reason I'm asking you this is that I heard, I think a lot of what at least I thought was implicit in what you were saying about apprenticeships, on-the-job training, getting young people into a job, early, like as part of their, education as a young person. Those sounded to me like some of the ways that we can teach soft skills. Do you have a sense of how soft skills versus technical skills, how to divide that up?
Got to be both, because the ultimate goal is success in the workplace, sustainable careers. You got to teach soft skills. You got to introduce young people to soft skills as early as possible. They have to learn by doing, not just by lecturing and talking and saying you need to do this. It's about experiential learning. And I think that the soft skills are important. And dealing with the other problems. I have a transportation problem. I can't get across town to go to the class. And maybe, this remote world is going to change some things. I have a childcare situation. I also have a part-time job. I've got to navigate through some of this. And that's the reality. Many of the folks we're talking about are women with children. We're talking about women with children. We're talking about men also. But, the challenges of being the mom, the caregiver, sometimes you're also taking care of an older parent, is the reality of today. The reality of 1970 and 80, maybe even 90 was a tad bit different. So I believe soft skills have to be a part of it. We focus on that. We do a lot of pre-apprenticeship training, which are focused on soft skills. And I do think we make a mistake if we don't think it's essential and it's important to the entire mix of what we need to do.
Thanks. So, Harry, I want to come back to you. So we've heard a bunch of this discussion is about all the different aspects of our workforce training system. And indeed, a really essential part of your proposal is bringing more coordination to this system. What would you say to the skeptic who says it's too multifaceted, it's too scattered of a system? We can't simply try to bring more coordination to it. The only way to have a successful workforce training system is to basically start from scratch and create an entirely new, fully integrated system from the beginning.
Well, before I answer that, I do want to respond to Marc's comment, his skepticism about the community colleges. And in fact, he was right. When you look at the completion rates, especially within 2 years, they are much too low. And even if you go out 4 years or beyond, they get better, but still not high enough. And I think part of the problem is that the vast majority of people who go to community colleges end up in the academic programs rather than the workforce side. And many of them aren't prepared academically, so they get stuck in developmental ed, these remedial programs that don't go anywhere. What I'm envisioning is really building up the workforce side and having really good guidance to help people find the programs, whether it's for credit or non-credit, the completion rates are actually much higher than they are on the academic side. And of course, what I'm envisioning is strengthening these partnerships with the community-based organizations that Marc was talking about, that Larry talked about, and the employers, and have more support for all that. Now, we can believe that you have to scrap everything and start from scratch. I would hesitate to do that. Number one, we wouldn't know if the brand new system is better than what we had before. Number two, there are pieces of the system that work quite well, right? There is strong labor market returns to a lot of the certificate programs that we have now. And like Larry said, especially if they are embedded in some kind of pathway, a first step along a pathway. So to me, wiping everything out and starting from scratch is unrealistic and very uncertain. I would rather take the things that we have seen in the evidence base that seem to work well, including the things at community colleges, and strengthen those pieces and strengthen the partnerships. And I think, we always talk about coordination, but usually we talk about coordination without providing any of the resources that are needed to build these bridges and build these partnerships. And so, I think providing these TACT grants, some of which will be formula-based as well as competitive, would enable the colleges, the employers, the community-based organization to build those partnerships to work much more effectively together, as we see happening in these sector-based training programs right now.
Your answer makes me optimistic, so thank you. So Madhuri, I want to ask you about funding. So Harry's proposal calls for greater funding for students, greater funding for the educational institutions themselves, and also for the firms, offering them better funding to do their own training within in-house. Where do you see the shortfalls? And if you see them everywhere, where do you feel like they're more acute in some places than in others?
I mean, I think Penny's intro remarks during the fireside chat really illuminated the overall funding challenge that we have in this country. We do not invest in workforce development. to the level of other, kind of economically advanced countries. And it's a real problem, especially because it's been declining over the past few decades, not only in the public side, but also the private investment in workforce as well, which we find to be incredibly concerning. Unfortunately, though, I work in a state government that, as almost every state government is very financially strapped right now. So it has to be both more funding, which we obviously have advocated for and will continue to do so, but also figuring out how do we use our funding more effectively, which I think, Wendy, goes to the second part of your question. Where do we find shortfalls in the system? I think that on the community college piece, it's something that I would agree with, but I think it's really a question of where the money goes. As Harry was just alluding to in the community college system, we've been very bullish the past 2 years of trying to create more funding targeted towards the workforce side of community colleges. So not the 2-year degree side, but really what are the ways that our community colleges can be competitive in creating high quality, employer-driven credential programs that can really lead to enhanced economic outcome for participants. For better or worse, where's the first place that people go for workforce development? It's usually the community college. And as Harry mentioned, folks can burn out on courses that may not actually help them economically, but that's the first place that people go. And then they go to nonprofit training providers, companies, others as a second kind of avenue for getting the skills that they didn't receive in the first place. Our view is we know people are going to the community colleges anyways. How do we make them work? And how do we actually build the systems and programs, which may not be on the degree side, that really can make sure that first shot when somebody walks in the door will result in a program and credit that can lead to a much better career pathway. So that's definitely one place that we have focused on. Another is really thinking about that infrastructure that I think Larry had alluded to as well, between businesses and our training providers and community-based organizations. Especially most employers in upstate New York and actually across the country are small businesses. They do not have the resources to create training programs or partner with other small businesses to create training programs that really would benefit their industry. This is something we're currently seeing with the video game industry, the software industry in upstate New York. We have a lot of really innovative small companies that are growing tremendously, but each one doesn't have the demand or capacity to create their own training program. So I think where the state can help is really trying to create those intermediaries between those groups to figure out, well, you one business don't have enough need on your own, but 10 of you together do. How do we create the resources and infrastructure to make sure that that results in a training program, ideally with a community-based organization, community college, or nonprofit training provider? So really solving that coordination problem among small business in particular is something that we also feel could be a really great way to kind of focus our limited resources to make sure that we have outcomes for ultimately the people we're trying to serve.
That's great. Thank you. So Larry, I want to ask you then about incentives. So one aspect of Harry's proposal is to impose a modest tax on firms that displace workers through automation. And I think part of the thinking behind that, or maybe at least part of the thinking behind that, is that our current system, fiscal policy system in place, mostly taxes, is that for firms, we create a lot of incentives for firms to put in place automation, invest in machines, and we need to do more to even out those scales so that firms also have incentives to train workers and train them to work alongside those machines that we are giving them incentives to put in place. So first, wondering if that resonates with you, and second, does it seem how likely is it that a system can change those incentives to make firms do more to retrain workers rather than displacing them with automation?
I mean, the argument that has been made, particularly by Doron Acemoglu, is if you look at the US tax system, the effective tax rate on capital that firms face and on automation investments relative to the tax on labor seems to be lower, and that potentially distorts investments and potentially.
It's negative. The implicit tax rate is negative for a lot of different kinds of capital. But anyway.
Right, it varies, but it's way lower than the taxes on labor, and clearly that can have a distortionary effect. And so some potential, it's not clear exactly how you target, automation or displacement. In principle, the unemployment insurance system is supposed to experience rate and provide a tax, but it's a very imperfect system. One can imagine on the margin a little bit of trying to change the incentives on the displacement side, but I suspect a lot of the returns to sort of training that don't get invested in are the types of things that are more valuable than at a single employer, and where poaching is potentially the big concern. And that's where intermediaries and community colleges and others may play a role. In potential, some subsidies for sort of training could help with individual employers. It's not clear that doing that is going to be that effective. I think expanding, the things like sectoral employment training programs, community colleges, potentially using some of the funding on a displacement tax or greater taxation on capital could do it on less. There are some grants for incumbent worker training. Harry's evaluated some in the past that are effective, but the skills that really don't get invested in are ones where workers may not be completely aware. They're valued by a wide range of employers, not just a single one, and therefore firms face a poaching risk if they invest in. And that's the place where educational and other training intermediaries may play an important role. And so I think there's some way of sort of combining this. What I'd just like to sort of say is, in the current system, we have a lot of touch points that seem to have high returns where we underinvest. The marginal four-year public university, we see people on the margin get very high returns. Take a Florida International University. Vocational programs at community colleges and high wage sectors, sectoral employment, and we have a lot of parts of the system that seem to have very low returns. The huge expansion of for-profit colleges in the Great Recession that took a lot of 25% of the Pell Grants and of the student loans, and where most unemployed and people of color went, have very low returns. And so combining greater scrutiny and regulation of parts that don't seem to be delivering returns and providing resources to expand the parts that have high returns seem to be, as opposed to just completely a new system. There are parts that work well, but they don't seem to get the funding, in parts that don't work well. And I think those are the keys in moving forward.
And again, comes back to data and making sure that any program that's put in place is also incorporates collecting data, evaluating the program to make sure that we have this good information to act on.
Yeah, and I think big data now that's becoming available allows us to learn much more rapidly, linking to administrative, which things are working, and also to potentially use the information of targeting which sorts of programs seem to have high returns for workers with certain skills coming in. There's a lot of innovative work going on, just like there's been innovation in automation. There's innovation in using big data for potentially targeting which types of workers would benefit from different programs, improving things like summer jobs programs that were brought up, where we're learning a lot, and where there seem to be potential ways of linking up employers with higher returns rather than just the traditional places that summer jobs programs have done. So I think the investments in the data and the infrastructure are also extremely important.
So I'd like to open up a question to all of you. So of course, all four of you have been working, as I said in my opening remarks at the very beginning, all four of you have been working on these really important issues around improving the workforce training system for a very long time, long before the COVID-19 recession struck. But we have a bunch of questions from the audience around what additional challenges has the COVID-19 recession created? How do we need to rethink whatever priorities we would have had coming into the pandemic? How does the pandemic potentially change those priorities going forward? So are there new challenges, new opportunities? Are there things that we should be doing differently now that we've learned what we've learned? I am trying to summarize a great many questions that basically say, what about COVID? So
Yeah.
anybody want to jump in?
I'll take it because, you know, we're doing an evaluation now of our programs in the year of COVID, because as many, we had to continue to provide services, but pirouette, as I say, to virtual experiences. And we're finding, for example, in workforce programs, the enrollment levels and the consistency of participation suffers in a virtual setting. We're finding, however, for example, and we do home ownership counseling, home buyer education, that the success rates and the participation rates seem to be more consistent than when people had to do it in person. So a good bit of this is maybe more nuanced, right? Program to program, the differential in what you face. And we also have a lot of people who walk in and they want to bypass training and they just want a job placement because they're trying to survive in the reality of now. So I think the real question is really going to be, how is the economy on the employer side going to change coming out of this? Is there going to be shrinkage in some jobs, expansion in some areas, and what are they going to be? Secondly, how providers, whether it's community college, four-year college, got a son who's a freshman at Penn, and he's on campus this semester, but he's doing classes virtually. Last semester, you know, how is it going to change? And those are hard to predict with great accuracy. I think we all have to recognize that there is going to be a new and a different normal. Like always, we need information and data. And, you know, I think somebody's kind of got to grasp this now and look at the experiences of 2020 and see what we learned from it. We're trying to learn because we're trying to plan, and we're trying to assess and evaluate what 2020 means and what may continue and what may have to go back to normal to get the success rates. Like, for example, we do after school programs. It's hard to do those with great effectiveness virtually, right? With middle school kids, et cetera, but some financial literacy, home buyer education may work. So it's a really important question for people in government. I think it's important for people in academia. I think we have to stand up some analysis fairly quickly, even if it's going to be anecdotal or incomplete, because we all need guidance. And I also think at this moment in time, with a new administration that wants to tackle some of these issues, they need as much guidance and information as possible. So we're not designing the proverbial Buick 225 to run in the 21st century, right? We're not building what used to be, thinking that what used to be will work in the future.
I am absolutely hoping that this event is you know, in service of that goal. Anybody else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'd raise.
If I could build on what Marc said. So COVID is going to generate several million additional dislocated workers beyond what the normal labor market generates. Way too many of those workers are going to be Black and brown and relatively disadvantaged. So we do need to make sure we have systems in place and resources to help them. I think the jobs that are permanently going to disappear in retail, in leisure and hospitality, there will be less traditional brick and mortar retail and a lot more online shopping, a lot more online ordering and delivery. So we want workers to be able to have access to those new jobs as well as others. I think digital skills are going to be a very, very important part of this thing. And as Marc said, you know, we need to follow the data to where the new demand is, but I think it's sort of a skill set, not just targeted to exactly specific jobs, but digital skills, soft skills, I think will be an important part of this. I also think more and more of the education and training after COVID are going to be delivered online than was true historically. A lot of these institutions are now even more strapped for cash than they have been. And so learning on that, what kinds of online education and training work especially for these disadvantaged populations, what's the optimal mix of online and more traditional in person. I think those should be higher on our agenda as well.
Larry.
Yeah. Building infrastructure.
Larry, you're coming in and out.
Can you hear?
Not very well. It might be best if you turn off, it would be sad, but I think it would work if you turned off your video. And then we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I think the other major lesson from this pandemic is highlights the growing divide between those of us who have jobs where we can work from home and those who don't, the people ordering the takeout and the people delivering it, and the huge differences that having some voice in the workplace and representation and ability to get safety, and it's reinforcing while training and education are important, to do a lot more to give clout and voice and some say in the way the workplace does, even to workers in lower wage jobs. And I think it reinforces the importance of the minimum wage, unionization, earned income tax credit, other ways of upgrading those jobs to complement it, and having a tight labor market, because the desperation that we're seeing is not going to be quickly solved by training employment. There are a lot of other very big problems that need to be complements, and it needs to be more comprehensive than that.
So Madhuri, I'm very happy to give you the last word.
Oh, great. It'll be echoing, I think, a lot of what was said, which is, I think over the past 2 years I've been in this role, a lot of our focus from a workforce support side has been on childcare and transportation. Those have been two really significant barriers for not only individuals to attend and persevere in training, but ultimately be able to obtain and maintain high quality jobs. And now the third element that has become incredibly important, if not as or more important, is broadband access, affordable broadband access, and device access. So as we think about our funding streams for workforce development, not only having flexibility for wage subsidies, childcare, transportation, broadband, and devices, we strongly believe need to be a part of that mix as well. Because otherwise that is quickly becoming a major barrier for individuals to re-enter the labor market today. And we don't want to have an economy that's bifurcated, where, if you have a device and can work from home and have a quiet space, you're a winner. And if you don't, you're not. That's it's leading to baked in inequality that we really need to aggressively address today.
Yeah, just highlighting that workforce training is just one aspect of the many challenges that we have in the labor market and in the road ahead. Well, all right. I'm worried that we just ended on a sort of a sad note, but a note highlighting the challenges, but a call to action. Thank you very much for joining us. I'd also like to again thank Penny Pritzker and Jason Furman for excellent framing of this event. And encourage you to go to the Hamilton Project's website and see Harry Holzer's excellent proposal with actionable ideas for policymakers to help improve the workforce training system. You can also see Kristen Broady's economic analysis that we just published today with her co-authors, describing the challenges faced by different demographic groups and how automation will affect different jobs over the coming decades. So thank you very much for joining us. I've gotten a lot out of this, and I am more optimistic about the changes that we'll see going forward as a result of this discussion. So thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.